Hello everyone. Today I will be explaining what are Canada-U.S. preclearance areas and are their implications. What are preclearance areas? Preclearance refers to an arrangement between two countries that allows customs and immigration officials from the country of destination to be located in the country of origin in order to clear or deny the admission of travelers or goods to the destination country. They are designated locations where preclearance officers may exercise their authorities. Preclearance signage is posted when entering a preclearance area to notify travelers of their obligations, their right to withdraw, and that biometric information may be collected. So here's a list of all the U.S. preclearance areas in Canada, and you'll notice they are predominantly in airports. There are currently no Canadian preclearance areas in the U.S., but the government is exploring the option. So a little background on preclearance areas between Canada and the U.S. The United States has been conducting air preclearance in Canada since 1952 under various arrangements. In March 2015, Canada and the United States signed a new treaty entitled the Agreement on Land, Rail, Marine, and Air Transport Preclearance between the Government of Canada and the Government of the United States, or LRMA, which was a commitment of the 2011 Beyond the Border Action Plan. Canada's treaty obligations under the LRMA have been implemented in Canada through the Preclearance Act in 2016. The LRMA and Preclearance Act entered into force in August 2019. I've elected to note certain elements in the action plan as it relates to concepts that will later be discussed. The action plan was established as a commitment towards working together, not just at the border, but beyond the border, to enhance security and accelerate the legitimate flow of people, goods, and services. Their areas of focus are as follows. As you can see, I've highlighted the relevant areas. Share information and intelligence in support of law enforcement and national security, cooperation to countering violent extremism in both countries, implement additional pre-inspection and pre-clearance initiatives, and expand joint leadership on international cybersecurity efforts. So what are the arguments in favor of Canada-U.S. preclearance areas? I'd like to preface that these are not my own arguments. The first, it allows Canadians to clear U.S. customs in their own country. In U.S. customs, you cannot withdraw and can be detained under U.S. law. U.S. preclearance officers in Canada must follow Canadian laws, including the Charter and Human Rights Act. In 2017, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made this point when defending the new act before it had become law. Law-abiding travelers shouldn't encounter problems at the preclearance zones. Once again, these are not my arguments. Time saver upon arrival. Once a passenger reaches the U.S., they land as a domestic passenger and can head straight for baggage claim or their connecting flight, saving valuable time. The third is security. According to U.S. Customs and Border Control, preclearance also has the benefit of stopping potential security threats before arriving onto U.S. soil as well. Now here are the most notable criticisms of preclearance areas. The first is that there are insufficient legal protections. Protection appears to be hollow due to Canada's State Immunity Act, which grants the U.S. government immunity in most cases. Bill C-23 also grants individual U.S. preclearance officers immunity from civil liability or civil proceedings and places limits on the extradition and arrest of any U.S. preclearance officer who may have committed offenses while in Canada. Passengers who believe preclearance officers may have violated their rights have little recourse in the courts. The second is that it violates Canadian charter rights. American preclearance officers could now further interrogate and request private information from Canadians who withdraw their application to enter the U.S. Bill C-23 allows for strip and cavity searches and monitored bowel movements, the removal of travelers to health facilities, and the use of force to inflict bodily harm, including lethal force, on the basis of their belief, suspicion, or reasonable grounds to determine it's necessary. There being of the preclearance officers. The third is targeted enforcement. The new rules are especially troubling for racialized populations such as those of Middle Eastern descent who could be targeted. Immigrants especially risk being profiled as terrorists, particularly if they have no papers. Preclearance areas provide valuable insight into the practices national security regimes have deemed appropriate to use on an ongoing basis in the war on terror, the most prevalent of which is unconsented data collection. Security agencies are constantly harvesting our most private information. The United States National Security Agency, NSA, being the primary culprit. They acquire consumers' personal data by cooperating with and sometimes forcing private companies, such as Google, Microsoft, Apple, and Meta, to fork over their users' data without the knowledge of its users. Data is taken from telecommunication companies as well. The content of said data includes phone calls, recordings, text messages, images, footage from webcams, emails, activity, entries, and posts on social media apps, browser history, and more. Also included is what's called meta content, which records the means of creation, the time and date of the creation, the creator, and their location during creation. The security agencies amass all of this data and connect the dots using profiling and visualization software. It would be reasonable to surmise that all of our activity and information on all of our smart devices is being extracted, compiled, and reviewed by entities that we might not be aware of. On the bright side, our data is not actively being watched or tracked. Instead, it's being processed. But at any moment, if for whatever reason the software identifies any of your behavior as potentially being a precursor to harmful acts, all of your data and activities can actively be watched and tracked as it's happening by NSA employees without your knowledge. For a suspected person with 100 friends, the person in charge of surveillance at the NSA or one of its private subcontractors can, without a warrant, put under surveillance all 2,669,556 potential connections. All of this goes to show the questionable practices occurring at preclearance areas are, in fact, perpetually occurring well beyond them. The United States is not simply granting or denying access to its territory, they are governing the mobility of bodies internationally. They work to separate our globalization of legitimate and civilized business and leisure travel from their globalization of trafficking and illegal migration. One method of doing so is biometric borders. They function in quite the same way as the aforementioned visualizing and profiling, insofar as they collect data, in this instance biometric, and it is integrated into databases which will determine your risk potential based on patterns of behavior. The most pressing issue with such systems is that they attempt to draw a clear, clean, and unambiguous line between legitimate, low-risk, and illegitimate, high-risk mobilities, a line that cannot be drawn but is always in the process of being drawn. Unfortunately, doing so may have catastrophic outcomes. Such was the case in the death of Jean-Charles de Menezes. Jean-Charles de Menezes was a Brazilian man killed by officers of the London Metropolitan Police Service at Stockwell Station on the London Underground after he was wrongfully deemed to be one of the fugitives involved in the previous day's failed bombing attempts. Once it became clear that de Menezes could not be represented as a threat, a struggle began to reposition his otherness as that of the illegal immigrant. The discovery that Jean-Charles' student visa may have expired 2 years previously led to questions surrounding his legality. Disputes emerged as to whether or not he was wearing a bulky jacket in hot weather or had jumped the ticket barrier. These disputes deflect from the accountability of officers and scrutiny of the databases and systems which wrongfully identified Menezes as a threat. Legal boundaries are being pushed and altered. Limits on security measures are ambiguous and discretionary. Citizens risk having their rights violated on home soil with no recourse. Citizens are denied their right to privacy. Information and data are forcibly extracted and compromised at borders and well beyond. People are being wrongfully detained and in some cases killed. All of these practices are fully enabled and enforced by the Canadian government. As individual citizens, we are hopelessly outmatched. We are the victims of pernicious infractions of our rights for the sake of fighting terror, whether we like it or not. Are the security measures being enforced worth the suffering they're causing? Are they justified? And a follow-up question. With technological advancements propelling the global expansion of security precautions and surveillance, the traditional conception of borders as fixed material barriers delineating sovereign states has become increasingly antiquated. Will this trend continue? Will material borders drift into irrelevance? Thank you for listening.